Hello, everyone. This is Brent Toma, and I'm one of the associate editors at Academic Life and Emergency Medicine. With me today is Dr. Keith Baker, the program director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Anesthesiology Program and author of the article that we discussed in the blog post, Determining Resident Clinical Performance, Getting Beyond the Noise. Thanks for joining, Dr. Baker.
Pleasure to be here.
So it's been a pretty big week for your article. In addition to being posted about on Academic Life and Emergency Medicine, some big names from the ACGME and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada have weighed in. And it's now being discussed on Twitter, the IceNet blog, and the Key Lime podcast. What do you think of all the attention?
Well, it's nice to hear that the work's being read and discussed. That's probably the best any author can actually expect, is to get their work discussed in an academic forum. That's as good as it gets.
Great. So in our discussion today, I was hoping that we could focus on the application of the assessment system that you described in your paper. So to start us off, could you provide just a brief overview of how the system is working in your setting and how you use it?
Yeah, so we've been doing this now for 5 years, and I think the nice thing about that is when the paper was written, I had 2 years worth of material to present, and we've now extended that more than 2.5 times again as far as amount of material. And the system is working even better, I would say, than when we first published it, meaning that the overall compliance or response rate is at around 60%, and about over 70% of all evaluations have the feedback, which is so critical to developing your residents. So I'm actually very impressed that our faculty continues to deliver on evaluation and feedback on a regular basis on behalf of our residents. And the way we do it now is, I think part of the success of the system is that it's quite automated in the sense that we have electronic systems that can determine which residents work with which faculty, and because of that, we target our requests for our residents to be evaluated to exactly the people who actually work with them. So you don't get requested to work with people you didn't encounter. We use the unit of 1 week as the evaluation size. So if you work with a resident on 1 day or 5 days, that's collapsed to a single request in a week. And then our faculty, at the rate of over 60% or so, will evaluate our residents with the piece of paper. It's a 5-page form. It's quite intimidating looking. But I've timed myself, and it takes about 7 minutes to fill out an evaluation form, including writing some text. And then those all go to the web, and that material is simply harvested about every month, fairly automatically, put into a process that automatically runs the numbers for us. And so it's fairly well automated in the sense of once the faculty input the data, taking it out, putting it into the system, and then letting the math, crunching the math is pretty straightforward.
Excellent. Okay, so I have two questions in follow-up on that. So one is that you mentioned that the system's automated. Could you explain how exactly you did that? Like, what did you use to automate it? How does that work? Are you using? Go ahead.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of different systems. So I'll give you a small rundown. So the residency evaluation system that emails out the actual evaluations is a company called New Innovations, and our whole academic medical center called Partners Healthcare uses that software company. And so our entire institution is based on that. And so what we did was contacted the computer folks, or the IS people at New Innovations, and we asked them if we could email them a list of which resident worked with which faculty. Could they generate evaluations and then email automatically to each faculty member on a weekly basis? And they agreed to that. So our IS people simply harvested the data from our automatic, our information systems that are all electronic, and basically at 1 in the morning on Sunday night, the computer has a look in itself and says which resident worked with which faculty, and we make 2 columns of the resident and the faculty that encountered each other during the week, and those are automatically FTP'd or sent automatically to the website at 2 in the morning on a Sunday when it's a low traffic time. The New Innovations system accepts that material automatically as a file transfer, and then they automatically generate the evaluations electronically, and then they're emailed individually to each faculty member, so that on Monday morning I receive an email, and I click on it, and it will say that I have some residents to evaluate. And if I click on that, up pops a form with the resident that I just worked with, and there's a picture of them in the evaluation form, and that's fresh in my mind so that I can evaluate them and submit it. And then when I submit it, it goes to the New Innovations website where all the information actually exists. And about once a month, we go in and harvest and pull all the evaluation material from that last month into our local system for calculating the z-scores.
That's awesome. It sounds like you've really found a way to make that work, to make that work such that it's not a huge burden getting those evaluations out to every person every week.
No, it works quite well. And we did have faculty complaining years ago when they would be requested to evaluate a resident that they actually had not worked with because the system linkage wasn't tight, and we've gotten rid of that completely.
Excellent. So you also mentioned that each evaluation form takes about 7 minutes, and it's done for the residents that you work with that week. I'm interested in hearing how you manage, whether you had some resistance from the faculty when you initially rolled that system out, and how you managed to deal with it to get such high levels of compliance that you're talking about.
We did have resistance, and there, I think we took our time in developing the actual evaluation tool, and by that I mean we developed one based on what we thought was the best evidence for evaluation and feedback. Then went to the residents with the draft form. We made edits according to some of their input. We then took that form and went to all faculty and allowed them to make edits, generating the final form. So I think we had the opportunity for people to respond to the form, what was asked, how it was asked, and so on, which allowed some buy-in to occur. We then went live with the program and had to do significant information sessions with our faculty just to let them know what this even was, because it was quite different than what we used to do. We used to simply ask the people who worked with residents on a monthly basis, on a rotation type basis, to evaluate the residents. And so a faculty member, and I was an example of a faculty member who did all the evaluations, I wrote them all for the residents rotating on the thoracic anesthesia rotation. So I would ask my colleagues about the residents. I would then pen a note to each resident and send it along to them. But our compliance with that process was terribly low, and much of the material given was quite whitewashed and not timely. Very significant delays in response and getting information to residents, which didn't serve our purposes of helping our residents or evaluating them. So that, although it was a big change in that system, the old system wasn't working well. And the other thing that was quite nice was that the new system gives voice to every single faculty member. You didn't need to be the head person to evaluate a resident as it used to be. Nowadays, every faculty member is as important as the next. So I think that's an important statement, and I do find that our faculty is very diagnostic, and when they're concerned about a resident, they have a reason for that. If they see good things, they have a reason for that. And so I'm delighted that we actually have a broad perspective of input from many different faculty with many different perspectives, and I've been very impressed with our faculty's contributions.
Excellent.
So I will say, Brent, that we do remind people on a regular basis. If they're not turning their evaluations in, they get email reminders, and if they're particularly delinquent, I might write them myself or ask them what's keeping them from doing it. So we do hassle them to a degree, and that's true.
It still sounds like you're getting some exceptional response rates. To move into the how the system works functionally with the math, I know there's been a few people who have made comments that it seems to be really complicated, all these Z-scores and everything else. Can you comment on the difficulty of taking the data that you're given and outputting it in a functional way, and how you do that, and whether it's difficult or you've been able to automate that as well?
Yeah, so these days it's quite automated, and I have been impressed as I listen to the podcast around that people have the impression that it's sort of only for high-stakes summative evaluation, perhaps. It's really overkill, it's too difficult, and so on. And I'll tell you, our faculty find it the same way. So we have a clinical competency committee in my department, and I've presented this material to them personally, and they still find it complicated. And I think I'm an okay presenter. So for some reason, there's a barrier to this material. And the Z scores, or Z scores as we call them, are really simple algebra. They are simply a statement of a faculty's numerical evaluation of a resident compared to how that faculty normally evaluates residents at that same postgraduate age. So we do age correction, and so it's as simple as subtracting two numbers and dividing by the sort of variance that or the score variation that faculty typically uses. So it's truly simple algebra, and each encounter with a resident that generates a form will generate one single Z or Z score, and then we average all of those up over the course of many months to get a large N point estimate of how that resident's actually performing, and then we get confidence intervals, and that is statistics, the confidence intervals. But the concept of there being a lot of noise in the system is what you would expect, I guess, based on every faculty seeing things a little differently. But averaging the different scores is truly simple algebraic averaging, and there's nothing special about it. So I find it curious that algebra and averaging of numbers has caused some barriers, and it appears complicated. So there must be something about how the words used, maybe the word Z-score, maybe the fact that to pull it off technically, yes, it's difficult. I mean, you have to know what you're doing and be very comfortable with writing code like I can do. And my IS people, I'm very comfortable working with them. So I do think there's a distinct amount of infrastructure that needs to be put in to set up the system, but once that system is set up, the computer will generate the averages rapidly, accurately every time. And so we are now enjoying the fruits of the infrastructure of, it's like driving on a road. Once you pave it, you can drive back and forth easily, but initially paving it is effortful, and there's a lot of work that's involved. That's true.
That makes sense. So you mentioned in terms of how you get what information you get globally, that you get a Z score for each student, or each resident, I guess. But when I'm looking at your paper, I note that you have normalized scores, that you have anchored or sort of criterion-based scores, and then you also have your list of activities, or which I guess probably now we'd call entrustable professional activities. How do you how does all of that information get amalgamated into one score, or do you also get that separately?
Yeah, so we do a complete analysis on all aspects of our form as a routine part of our assessment of our residents. We create what I call a dashboard. So we take summary statistics from the entire process and generate a single page of the number of faculty who provided evaluations, how many evaluations were given in the time frame that we're studying, the relative to peers Z scores, the absolute Z scores, and then the 8 graded cases, or entrustable professional activities, as you might call them. And those are all created and all put forth on this single page dashboard that really allows you to see all the data and put it in context. So that process of doing that is something that it's like setting up a web page. Once you set it up, there's your web page, but you have to create each calculation, you have to put it on the page, and then print it all out or have it run, and we do that. And so every 3 months, our clinical competency committee gets together and we review our residents at the dashboard level, and we look at all the material. There's a bunch of us, a group of perhaps 10 or 12, that we put the dashboard up on a screen in front of us. We can all see all the data, and then we also have all comments, which I term feedback. All comments are available for the faculty to read and inspect. And so we look at any resident whose Z scores are lower than we'd like them to be, or what are distinctly below average, and that simply lets us know that there might be something dragging their performance down compared to the peers. We then turn our attention to the feedback, or the written commentary that our faculty have been putting in, and that's where we find the cause of the low Z scores, And if we think that it's something we can help a resident with, or it's something that should be fixed, then we will take action, intervene, work with the resident to improve whatever is spoken about in the written material. So we use the Z-scores as identifiers of residents' relative performance, and then we use the actual feedback to do diagnosis to let us know why the Z-scores or Z-scores are lower than average, and then we make an intervention, and oftentimes we have some very nice returns on effort with that because our residents are interested in improving. They don't argue with the data. They seem to understand that the faculty are have their best interest and want them to improve. So the process of using Z-scores to identify people, using feedback to figure out what to work on, has been very fruitful for us.
Excellent. You answered even my next question after that. The final thing I was hoping to ask you is, if you look in the assessment literature, there's some discussion about summative and formative feedback and potentially difficulties that result from combining those two things. Now, effectively, if I understand your system correctly, you're using multiple small assessment in a way that is both formative and summative. And I'm interested if your residents have had any resistance to the fact that those scores that they're getting will be, which are largely formative initially, are going to add up into something that really is summative and has some implications for them.
Brent, that's a really critical point. And I think this brings up a highlight of what is written in the paper but is not heavily featured, which is that we divorce or dissociate the actual numbers and the feedback. We separate them electronically nowadays. We only provide the feedback, the written comment and text, to our residents, and we do that every 2 weeks. All the comments that have come in every 2 weeks are electronically pushed to each resident and their mentor, and they are required to review it. They may not agree with it, but they must review it. That is the only thing we provide to our residents. We do not provide them with their summary Z-scores, individual Z-scores or Z-scores, because we do not feel, and I think the educational literature is quite strong on this, evaluation does not help people inherently improve, and in fact it is a strong demotivator to improvement in many contexts. So we use the feedback as the way to help people learn what's working well for them and what they need to focus on to become a yet better doctor. The Z-scores or Z-scores system is simply used by the clinical competency committee to make sure that we are minting physicians that we all agree are in good shape. And when we find physicians who are not up to par, we use that as a strong statement that we need to help that resident improve. And we don't think it helps the resident to let them know that they're below average. That has never been shown to be a useful strategy to tell someone they're below average. But we do say that we want them to improve on whatever we've identified. And as I mentioned, we do not get much resistance. Our residents know we have their best interest in when we come to them and ask them to work on something. And I will tell you, too, that I do not release the Z-scores or Z-scores outside my office to outside entities because they are not useful for those purposes. That's not what they're designed for. Our whole system is designed singularly to make sure that we are helping each resident develop to the best of their abilities. And we think we do a good job of that. And in the rare occasion when we find a resident who needs to really improve quite a lot, is distinctly below average, our system picks those people up promptly and allows us to work with them. And if they aren't able to make things better for whatever reason, and there are reasons, then we can decide if the specialty is appropriate for them and how we might help them besides becoming an anesthesiologist, for example.
Wow, thank you very much for all of that information. I think you've helped to clarify a lot about how this system is used, and hopefully this illustrates the publication that you've already made, which I was interested in featuring because it seemed to me that it pushed forward the literature to some degree, and I was a little bit surprised that not everyone had been talking about it as much until now. So hopefully this little highlight we've done here will get people thinking about this in a little bit more and see how you learn from all of the substantial amount of work that you've done. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Well, I think giving voice to small programs and the difficulties they have with this sort of a system, that's a very real concern. For example, if you had only 2 residents, or you had very few evaluations, then the process of signal averaging out the noise wouldn't work very well. So very small fellowships might have a problem with this. I do know that at least 2 other substantial programs in the United States have implemented the system in full, and in my talking with those individuals in those programs, they are very pleased with the system, and the way it works for us has been working for them. So I think our experience here is getting generalized beyond one institution to other institutions, which is very nice to see that the process is actually generally useful.
Do you have any plans for any follow-up research?
I do. There's quite a lot of things we can do to follow things up here. One thing I'd like to do, and I think it's a point that's very important, is that when we deliver feedback to our residents, it's not all positive, and even the very finest physicians that I know get some feedback that is, you might even call negative, but is not positive. And that's a really important message for learners and evaluators, that even the best folks get stuff that's not positive, and the goal is to work on that. And to be able to accept that is an important feature in professional growth. We're very accustomed to wanting to get everything to be positive, and that's nothing wrong with that. But I do think it's important for boards of registration in medicine to realize that a single negative ding or a few negative comments do not make a bad doctor. It's when the lion's share of the data are concerning that I think we have a problem, and I think that's an important message to get out there. The other message that I am working on, and we are in the process of producing a paper, which will take a little while to write because it's a little complicated, is that our faculty has largely been very worried, and I think I speak for them broadly, they're worried that when they evaluate a resident negatively, that there'll be repercussions to that faculty member, probably in the terms of how that resident then evaluates their teaching. So we have a linked system where we evaluate our residents on their clinical performance, and those same residents evaluate the faculty on their teaching performance. So I think there is concern that if you give a low score, or write negative comment to your resident, that they might in turn take it out on you and seek a little retaliation for your negative score that you've delivered. And we've looked quite exhaustively at our data, and there is, at what I call macroscopic level, we have no sign of retaliation. And by that I mean faculty members who give very high or very lenient scores do not get higher teaching scores, and similarly faculty who give very harsh scores do not get lower teaching scores. And then we've done a very, I think, very elegant analysis at the dyadic level, and there we can find a very small retaliation effect, but it's trivial, and I want to quantify exactly how big it is, but practically speaking it's not important. And that's a really important message, because so many people grade inflate because of the concern about getting retaliated against, and we don't find that signal, or actually we find it, but it's tiny, and it's not the sort of thing you would act on. And then lastly, our system is also unique in many ways because we have bidirectionally confidential data, which means that everybody who made an evaluation is known to the system, but we do not put that on the forms. So if a faculty member wants to identify themselves, they have to add their name to the form, and same with the residents. So we do that because our faculty was very clear that they wanted anonymity to put the information that they wanted on that piece of paper, and they wanted to feel safe. So we afforded them that anonymity, and the residents gain the same anonymity. So that's a unique aspect of our system that not everyone believes, and there are some people who think you ought to put your name on your evaluation forms, and I was one of those people some years ago, but I've changed my tune, and I now don't argue with it, and I'm getting plenty of data as the compliance suggests that it's working for us.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I know you're post-call and definitely need a nap at this point, so we really appreciate you coming to share all the excellent work you've done, and hopefully a lot of other people can make use of it.
Thank you, Brent.